Hello, everyone. With us here today is Indiana Senator Travis Holdman, former NCOIL president, Indiana Senate Majority Caucus leader, and chair of the Indiana Senate Tax and Fiscal Policy Committee. Hello, Senator Holdman, and thank you so much for joining us for this month's NCOIL 101 interview.
My pleasure. My
Okay,
pleasure.
so let's hop right in. I wonder how you first got involved in public service.
Well, I had been county chairman or vice chairman for about 15 years with a local party, and I really think it was kind of a God thing that occurred. I had always aspired to be more than what I had been as the county chairman, and I had an opportunity to run for county council, and so I ran for county council and won that race. And then, oddly enough, our state senator passed away. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Just lived about 7 weeks from the time he was diagnosed until he passed. And at the time, I was making a move away from banking. I had been a bank CEO for about 12 years, and my board chairman at the bank was the House Ways and Means chairman for the Indiana House of Representatives. And when Senator Ford passed away, my board chairman called me up and said, "Hey, I think you need to consider running for that seat." It was in a special caucus where precinct committeemen from the Senate district come together at the bidding of the state party and elect someone to finish out the term for that senator who passed away. And there was a 4-person race, and I actually won on the 3rd ballot, and that was 14 years ago.
Wow.
So,
And so what issues have you been most involved in throughout your time in the legislature?
shortly after I was elected, I was appointed chairman of the Insurance and Banking Committee, and so a lot of what I was doing had to do with the banking and insurance regulation and legislation in the state of Indiana. That's when I became active in NCOIL, replaced the individual who had been participating from Indiana at NCOIL meetings. Vice Simpson was her name, Senator Vice Simpson. She stepped down from the Senate to run for lieutenant governor in an unsuccessful bid. So that was really my start there. Chaired the Banking and Insurance Committee for maybe 6-7 years, and then another retirement took place in the Senate, and I was asked to take over as Tax and Fiscal Policy Chairman. And so I'm not even on the Insurance and Banking Committee anymore at all. As a matter of fact, with being caucus chairman, I'm only on one other committee in the Indiana Senate.
Interesting. So you mentioned that you were bank CEO and you also were a deputy prosecutor. How do you think all of that professional experience kind of translated into how you serve in the legislature?
Well, it was a great experience being in the prosecutor's office, and that translated well to banking, because when we would have problem loans, coincidentally, I recognized some of the names of the people who we were having trouble collecting loan payments from, because I had prosecuted them. And created some interesting discussions in the boardroom when we talked about delinquencies. So they were delinquent in more than just their payment to the bank. But then it really worked out well in making that transition from the prosecutor's office to banking. And then when I left the bank, I went back just to practice law and got elected in that special caucus. And so it all worked out for the best. But having that experience in banking and in the prosecutor's office really helped me out in the legislature to be a little more well versed in several areas of the law. And right now, I think we have maybe 8 or 10 members out of the 50 Senate members in the Indiana Senate that are attorneys, and so it's a small band of folks that are lawyers, but those come to us with varied experiences as well.
Right. So you've also become very well versed throughout your consulting in captive insurers. As you know, NCOIL passed a captive insurer model recently. Do you think captive insurers should have more or less regulation, and should that be uniform across all states?
Well, I think it is helpful if it's uniform across all states, except there are states that just choose not to enact captive legislation because it's a substantial investment on the part of the the state if they develop an office for captive insurance, because not everybody can do that. It takes some expertise and some know-how, and with small captives, 831B captives or micro captives as they're called, the premium tax is quite small, and so you have to have quite a large number of insurance companies that are captives in your state to make it worthwhile, just because you can't afford to do it otherwise.
Interesting. All right. So moving on, how did you first hear about NCOIL and how many years you've been involved?
Well, probably about 13 years that I was involved with NCOIL, and came to be very active in the organization, and went through the ranks of through the chairs, and went through a transition back about 7 years ago, or however long it's been since Tom has been part of NCOIL, and we changed our CEO, and I was the board president when we changed our management company that was managing us, and that was quite a challenge to get through that, but things have gone very well and been very successful under Tom's leadership.
Yeah. So what went into that change, and how do you think it's worked going out throughout the years, looking back on it now?
Well, it's always difficult when you change management companies and you change personnel. There's always opportunity for hard feelings. A lot of personality issues sort of surface in those times, and we weren't immune to that as well in NCOIL. But it was just the right thing to do, and I think it brought a great challenge for me personally to get that done. But I had the support of a lot of members of NCOIL working to push a change along, and we made some pretty important changes to the way we did business as NCOIL.
Yeah. So part of the change of strategic direction was you directed a SWOT analysis, strengths, opportunities, threats, and weaknesses, to be conducted. Do you feel like that was do you feel like as an organization that's something that should be done, periodically, and if so, how often?
Well, I usually recommend, because that's part of the business that I've been in my professional career. I think about every 5 years, it's important to take a look at what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and sort of chart a new path for where you're going. And it may mean that you make no changes, but I think a lot of times management becomes a little bit lazy, and it's good to sort of recalibrate and reset what you're doing to make sure you're keeping true to your principles that you and your charter that you set out to initially.
That's right. So given that, where do you think NCOIL would be today if you hadn't acted and made that strategic change?
Well, I don't think it was all me. I think it was a core group of folks that wanted to see some change, and I'm not sure that the organization would necessarily have survived had we not gone through that process of strategic planning, because that was sort of the impetus to bring about some great change for us, to involve the folks in the industry much more than what they had been involved in the past. And I think it was a key to the organization continuing and flourishing as it has.
And then besides that change in structure, how else would you say the organization has changed throughout your involvement?
Well, membership has changed significantly. We can do more because we've been able to raise revenue much more. We've had much more participation by industry folks in the insurance industry. We have many more participants, participating members, legislators involved than what we've had before. The big change, I think, has really come with just the change in membership because of term limits in a number of states, especially in the Midwest. And there's been some new people come on the scene that have really brought some great ideas to the organization. And it's really flourished because of that, I believe.
Great. Yeah. So what would you say might be one of your most valuable takeaways from being a member of NCOIL, and how do you think that kind of ties into encouraging newer legislators, like you were talking about membership change, to start participating?
Well, I think don't be afraid of stepping up to the plate and leading. Um, if you're a legislator, you're a leader in your own right because of the fact that you got elected to the position that you're in. And don't shy away from being a leader in the organization because otherwise we'd be in a world of hurt if folks didn't step up to the plate and take the opportunity to lead and to do what they needed to do. I think it just really comes about by doing what you think is the right thing that needs to be done for the organization. Nothing for yourself. There's no self-glory in all of this. That's really what's best for the whole country when we take a look at state-regulated insurance.
Great. Yeah. And so speaking of leading, what do you think first motivated you to run for an officer position within NCOIL?
Well, somebody approached me and asked me if I would consider doing it. And I'm not sure why that occurred. Maybe I was just I looked like I was vulnerable, perhaps, or they caught me at a weak moment. But uh, they approached me and asked me if I'd consider running, and I said I would give it consideration, and I'm glad I did. I think I was able to contribute something to the organization because of that.
Great. And what do you see as benefits for NCOIL for non-legislators like industry and consumer representatives?
Well, it gives them a voice, and when issues come up specific to insurance, it's much easier to do it at an NCOIL meeting than it is traveling from state to state to try to get in touch with legislators. And it just is a great environment to advance policy and to do what needs to be done from an industry standpoint, because we rely heavily on the testimony of the industry folks and participants other than members and other than legislators. And I think that's very important for us to keep an open mind to new issues that are on the horizon and that are developing that we haven't heretofore thought about.
Yeah. So were there any issues or model laws that you worked on personally that you was like one of your favorites throughout your time?
Well, let me think here. Incorporation by reference was one of the issues that we tried to tackle, and it's very difficult to deal with that because it really ends up with the NAIC making laws in your own state because we incorporate by reference the manuals that the NAIC publishes and adopts. And so it makes it very difficult sometimes for the state to know what their policy or what the law is because we have incorporated those manual changes into state code. The one thing that we have done is require the state commissioner to report to us on an annual basis the changes that are made in the manuals that affect the code. They tell us that in many cases those are not substantive changes, but I think we all realize that many of those have become substantive changes, and that's a very great concern to me as a policymaker that we've sort of relinquished the control of making policy to appointed individuals in government throughout the country.
So given that, yeah, like you said, giving policy, you make having other people make laws, appointed individual. Do you feel there's a lot of polarization in the Indiana legislature that prevents laws from being made, or is it just something that's happened throughout the time?
Well, I think there's a good thing that goes on because I think tension is healthy. And in the Indiana Senate this past session, we're somewhat out of balance. We have 39 Republicans and 11 Democrats in the Indiana Senate, but we get along well. 60% of bills passed by the Indiana Senate this past session were unanimous decisions by the Senate. 90% were bipartisan votes that took place that passed legislation. And so I think it comes of a healthy dialogue that takes place across the aisle, and something that you don't see in Washington, D.C.
Fair enough. Have you seen any of that polarization transfer over to NCOIL, or is it more like Indiana where it's a little more bipartisan?
Well, it's even more bipartisan at NCOIL, because there would be times where I would have to look up a member's bio online while they would be speaking to find out if they were Republican or Democrat, because I couldn't tell by their speech, which is a very healthy thing. And I think the organization transcends politics many times, and that's one of the great things about NCOIL.
Great. So, naturally we've discussed some of the things, positive things about NCOIL, but there's of course always things we can do better. What are some steps you want to see to make NCOIL improve in the future?
Well, if there's no plans to do strategic planning, I think that's one thing that needs to be put on the agenda at a future meeting before too long, just to make sure that we're on the right path and that things are moving in the right direction. I think getting participation amongst states that haven't participated, and I think the current administration has worked hard to make that happen. But getting more participation by members, legislators throughout the country, would be something that NCOIL could benefit from.
Great. So before we let you go, we have some lighthearted questions to help some people get to know our NCOIL legislators a little bit better. Can you tell me what your favorite all-time movie is?
Well, it would be Gladiator or Braveheart, one of the two. I think I've seen Gladiator about 25 times. So, and
Either
my
way, it's
wife,
a good choice.
I'll be scanning through the Dish network, and I'll see that, and I'll flip it on, and my wife is like, "Oh no, not again!" She goes upstairs when I flip on Gladiator to watch it again. So,
Good choice, though. Favorite all-time book or musical artist?
um, well, gosh, that's a tough one. Like to consider myself a man of faith, and so the Bible would be something that I ascribe to as probably my favorite book. Can't get too much of reading it these days, especially.
Sure. Okay, favorite meal?
Red meat, medium rare.
There you go. Good answer. Three dinner party guests, living or dead?
Oh my gosh. Abraham Lincoln, uh, Ronald Reagan, and George Washington.
Sure, that would be a very interesting conversation you guys would have there.
Very, very political, wouldn't you say?
That's for sure. Well, so then this wraps up this month's NCOIL one-on-one interview with Indiana Senator Travis Holdman. Senator Holdman, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.